Hi, I'm Peter Nixon, author of various books on dialogue and negotiation and business development, which you can see behind me. I'm recording this message from my studio in Hong Kong, but I'm Canadian. And when I was tall enough to post my own letter to Santa, my parents reminded me to be careful, to probably not do that, because there was a time in Montreal when the French separatists wanted to take the province out of the country. And to attract attention to their cause, they were putting bombs in the letter boxes in English communities. So this caused a lot of people to be frightened, and it changed my whole paradigm of a mailbox. But it also opened up my interest in dialogue and negotiation, because there was a lot of issues that were important to French Canadians at that stage, so much so that they felt they were being ignored and wanted to separate. Because they have a distinct language and culture, a wonderful language and culture that in the sea of North America's English Americanization, they were worried they were going to lose. And most importantly, young people felt completely disadvantaged because the best jobs and opportunities and salaries, housing and everything else was going to those who would operate in English rather than in French. So it was a very political environment. In the end, 3 referendums didn't achieve the separation which they had hoped for. But the leaders, right from the beginning, engaged in dialogue. They wanted to understand the issues, and they started to address the issues. And the more they understood the perspectives of the other side, the more that they could clarify what was wanted and what the problems were. And through this dialogue, Quebec has achieved a legal recognition of its distinct society in Canada. The prospects for French Canadians has improved greatly, and the cultures continue side by side in what has become a very multicultural country of Canada. So respecting the French Canadians was the first step in respecting all different cultures. I moved to Hong Kong in the aftermath of Tiananmen Square. And I found in Hong Kong those who hadn't fled in worry about the handover of 1997 to China were fairly apolitical. They were resolved to the situation as it was then and focused pretty much entirely on their jobs and their personal lives. And I found that surprising because the population size of Hong Kong and Quebec are roughly the same. Both have distinct languages and cultures different from the mass of people around them. And yet, whereas Quebec wanted to fight to protect its distinct society, Hong Kong was surrendering itself to a future under the Mandarin speakers in China. And I thought, well, I'm learning. And that seemed to be okay, except for the other aspect which was causing the problems in Quebec in the 70s and 80s. And by 2014, the young people had started the Occupy movement and were protesting not just about the protection of their own culture, but also the lack of prospects for themselves. Because at that point, a lot of the best jobs and salaries were going to those who chose to operate in Mandarin. And they were told to keep quiet, to stop protesting, to go back to work and go back to studies. But things were not addressed. The underlying problems were never addressed, and the leadership never dialogued and never showed a willingness to dialogue. So as problems do when they're ignored, they erupted again 5 years later into the protests that we've seen in Hong Kong in the last year. And yet, even though protests have escalated even further than they did then, there hasn't been any dialogue. And now China has imposed a national security law to basically arrest anybody who is unhappy and feels that they're not being listened to. So that's not going to solve the problem either. And if we compare the two situations, Quebec in Canada and Hong Kong in China, one was resolved through dialogue. It wasn't easy, but it was years of dialogue and mutual recognition, care, and compassion. And the other, Hong Kong and China, has so far been greeted by avoidance and harsh crackdowns on those who disagreed. The situation in Canada became known as Two Solitudes. It was coined by an English author called Hugh McClellan. And he didn't actually invent the term Two Solitudes, but it does apply very well. It was created in 1904 by the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who interestingly suggested that two sovereign people come together through love and respect. And McLennan simply said that two sovereign nations come together through love and respect for each other. And that's really what's needed here in Hong Kong and China, is that these two nations, the Cantonese of Hong Kong and the Han Chinese that are ruling Beijing at the moment, should love and respect each other and not force one or the other to submit to the unilateral wishes and aims of the other group. Solution is in the dialogue, and there is many examples of where it's worked. The only problem is you need to convince the leaders to do it, and you need to persist, and it's not easy, but it works, because everything else just sweeps the problem under the carpet, and it will come back if it's not eradicated. And eradication means resolved, not killed or imprisoned, and that's what we're aiming for. So please remember the solutions in the dialogue. Two solitudes can love and respect each other only through dialogue.